Peter Skinner, Socialist member, British Socialist member of the Economic Affairs Committee. A deal has finally been done on alternative investment funds, hedge funds and private equity and so on. How far does it lean towards the Parliament's position?
Well, I think it goes a long way in terms of the transparency issue, for sure. Now we can find out who is behind these funds and just where they're coming from and what kind of people perhaps are going to ask companies and corporations that they may get involved in to do certain things. So I think actually Parliament's initial stages of looking for the transparency issue has been a big win for the day.
But France and Germany were against the idea of passports for non-EU based alternative investment fund managers. That does seem to have been a victory for the Parliament, but it was already a victory at ECOFIN, wasn't it? Because the Belgian compromise that was tabled, well, best part of a couple of weeks ago, actually was what was adopted.
Well, yeah, I don't know what big countries were doing, but you know, this is an EU piece of legislation, and for the European Union to work, you know, you've got to allow anything that people pass through in one country to be passed through into others. So that was the passporting process. So I'm glad that that's been pushed through. I mean, it's been staggered. I mean, the one thing is that the first phase will be that those people who are European fund managers will be able to passport through from 2013, from 2015 non-EU funds. So there will be a staggered phasing in, but nonetheless it is good news.
Of course, in the meantime, during that period up until 2015, the bilateral sorts of agreements that are overseen by financial controllers, like for instance Britain's Financial Services Authority, those will be allowed to continue, and they will continue until there's been a chance to look at how well this passport scheme is working, I gather.
Yes, that's right. It's called the national placement. I think you're perhaps right, is that the local regulators who have perhaps the greatest idea and have best competence to understand what these organisations are doing on the ground, like the Financial Services Authority in Britain, will be allowed to continue this practice until 2018, where they will be reviewed. But of course, you know, it doesn't mean that they'll end. Let's see. I think, to be honest, it's a pretty good compromise, really, where the Commission, if they want to, can call a halt and say, look, you know, that's not worked, or indeed can maybe something coexist at the same time. We don't quite know. So in the spirit of compromise, we've got something slightly in the middle there.
As far as the depositories are concerned, now that was another area of concern, this idea that depositories would have responsibility. They would actually be financially liable for the funds if they went bottom up, as it were. I mean, is that a victory as well?
Absolutely. I mean, after the Madoff affair, where there was very little difference between the depository and, of course, the fund managers, there is clearly some implication about where were the investors' protectors in all of this. Something I pushed for very directly. I'm very pleased now that we've actually enhanced the rulemaking that will be expected for the depositories to actually play in this respect. And I think it's a victory for common sense and for the investor protection.
Now, when I was in the City of London back in March of this year, I was talking to people there from hedge funds, from private equity firms and so on. They were saying that it's a one-size-fits-all kind of rule, though, and that in fact the rules that apply to some hedge funds don't apply to others and certainly wouldn't necessarily apply to private equity. They are different creatures, and the problem is that too many politicians don't actually understand those differences.
I think there's room to breathe in this, and the first thing that has to be said to the critics that are still out there is that actually, I hate to say this, but it could have been much worse from their perspective. The reality is actually now, in this tighter rulemaking, we had to first of all register, and we have a central register for all these particular fund managers and organisations. We have something which actually means that we have a rule across 27 member states. So for that, we have to have a level of compliance which fits all member states. That is difficult to do, but we have something which has generally been expected to have been one way, which has actually now moved slightly the other. I think there's a certain generosity in this, and I hope that we'll be able to use it in that respect.
You know, Asian fund managers had a meeting in Hong Kong not so very long ago, a few days ago, where they were saying they were still trying to influence this. They were afraid that they would be shut out of the marketplace, which would be very bad for Asian fund managers. That hasn't actually happened, though, has it?
No, it hasn't. And in fact, the national placement, the issue about fund managers being able to have passporting across the European Union after 2015, it's a victory, actually, for non-European Union fund managers and funds. Now, clearly, given all the speculative discussions that were had beforehand, this is something which allows, as I say, scope for breathing, whilst that time exists where we can actually review the operation and see whether or not this is something which is going to be adequate to the cause that we've put it to.
What about, I mean, the warnings that came from the City of London that it would be very bad for the City of London, big generator of revenue for the United Kingdom? In fact, some people are now saying the rules as they've now been agreed will actually boost the City of London.
Well, at last. I mean, we have rules. You know, and people should actually welcome the fact that we have rules. I didn't find anyone who didn't agree with that. But what we have got to do is make sure that these are the rules which actually people will allow to work, and that includes regulators. We can have the FSA still doing the national placement. That's a good thing, alongside the development of EU regulation, which over time I think will prove to be a good safe haven for many of the companies and corporations that want to do business in the EU.
So the fears expressed by some of the tabloid newspapers and perhaps by one or two of the broadsheets too are not going to be realised.
Well, Jim, I think you've actually started to answer the question for me myself.
Peter Skinner, thanks very much indeed.
Jim, thank you.